今晚要干嘛？宵夜进来讲。今天是我们访问的第2期，今天晚上我的来宾一样是 Dr. Sophie Richardson， 还有 Dr. Tiffert。我今天有很多问题要请教他们，其中一个我觉得可能我认为最关键的就是，我们知道在台湾有很多人会觉得，哎呀，这个台湾跟中国不能比啊，我们那么小，中国那么大，好，然后台湾人数这么少，中国那么多，我们 blah 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 blah， 因此故得正，没有必要去挑衅中国，台湾不应该武装自己，我们只要乖，乖就会被摸头，乖就会有糖吃，乖就会没事了。如果以史为鉴，我们都会知道 that's not the way things work， 绝对不会有这么一回事。为什么让自己强大，才可以守护我们自己的我们的家园，我们的和平？我待会会针对这个部分好好的请教 Glenn， 我也会请教他。到底我们这边提防中国，这提防那，到底中国要的什么？到底习近平他最终极的目标是什么呢？一起来看今天的宵夜进来讲。What I want to go deeper into is then why do you do what you do? You've both studied China for 3 decades at least. What sparked your interest in human rights violations and your interest in China-Taiwan relations?
You first.
Sure. Look, I'm a historian of China by training. 20th century
college?
China. Yeah, PhD. I teach courses on late imperial and 20th century China. It's been a fascinating subject of study for me. Intellectually, really rich. It's a country that's increasingly important. We need to understand it in the world. So there is all of that. But why do we do it? Because I think it's increasingly important for us to get this right, to ensure that the outcomes in the world in which we live are desirable to us. And I have tremendous affection for people that I've come to know in China who want a more pluralistic, open China, who nothing lasts forever, will hopefully get the chance to express that. And so we work for that day as well.
Yeah, I think I've always been a little bit skeptical about governments and how they choose to wield their power. And that's partly the environment in which I was raised, but also a function of, the first time I went to the mainland was in the late summer of 1989.
That very summer.
That very summer. And I was going to a college at the time that's known for political activism, and everybody is always off protesting everything. And being in an environment where people who are exactly my peers were still being punished for having engaged in that same behavior, I think left a pretty profound impression on me. And the two things combined, I think, are about trying to ensure that people all over the world have equal access to human rights. And to making that a reality for as many people as possible. And I think people who live in democracies now are getting a bit of a dose of what it can be like to live under arbitrary and or increasingly authoritarian rule, to deal with governments that are not interested in the rule of law. And I think, if I have a hope, it is that these experiences galvanize more people, both to have sympathy for those who, through no fault of their own, live under regimes that are not interested in human rights, but also, that we can sort of renew a commitment to the collective project that we should all have the right to free speech. We should all have the right to, participate in elections. We should all have the right to be free of discrimination.
Speaking of freedom of speech, I was just talking to Badiou Cao, and we're not going to go into that during this interview, but he was saying that he was surprised by a recent series of events that took place since 2024 in the US. He lives in Australia, of course. He was surprised when he see things happening in the US that he didn't think he would ever see. But that's a different discussion. I want to pivot a little bit to the prospect of a conflict, and I want to ask Glenn.
Right.
The Hoover Institution's report on day one, an economic contingency plan for a Taiwan crisis. the report highlights a sobering reality, which is that large-scale economic sanctions alone may not be enough to change Beijing's behavior, while potentially it could actually cause severe disruptions to the global community. Mm-hmm. If a Taiwan Strait crisis were to erupt sometime soon in the near future, what economic tools would be the most effective then in supporting Taiwan? And how can the international community help safeguard Taiwan's economy and its critical semiconductor industry?
Right, it's a very important question. Look, Xi Jinping has made it abundantly clear it is his intention to absorb Taiwan, to deny Taiwan the agency to determine its own future. And we have it within our power, a coalition of nations in this region and also elsewhere around the world, the United States, Europe, to ensure that we make it abundantly clear that the costs of doing that would be so high that China would hopefully make the calculation, Xi Jinping would make the calculation that today is not the day. It is within our hands, really, to determine that and to ensure that, you know, he is not tempted to pull the trigger. And so it's a multiplicity of things. It is about demonstrating that we have the unity across nations so that we made the mistake in Ukraine, for example, of where deterrence failed, of not demonstrating to Putin that the world would stand together against his aggression on Ukraine. I think he underestimated what he would unleash, and it's turned out to be very, very negative for him, but at tremendous cost for Ukrainians in particular, but also Russian soldiers who are being ground down there. So let us learn from that lesson and ensure that we have the military, political, diplomatic, and economic resources to signal to Xi Jinping, don't do this, because it will turn out very poorly for you. And so that's the ball in our court, and it's up to us to ensure that we do this.
I don't want to drag you too deep into domestic politics, but was it confusing then for, I guess, the U.S. when here in Taiwan, in our own legislative yuan, some lawmakers were they disagreed with our defense budget, and we therefore couldn't procure weapons from the U.S. Did it send a really confusing message to the international community on our own will to defend ourselves?
The practice of democratic politics is inherently confusing, and in particular, Taiwan's legislative yuan is I think, an extremely vibrant place in which passions are expressed, sometimes involving animal parts. But this is normal for a democracy. I think it's absolutely appropriate for a people to debate its own future and how to allocate its resources. So again, it is up to the Taiwanese people and the parties who represent them to determine the path forward for them. And the United States, I think, stands as a partner in helping them realize the future that they want to create.
Absolutely. And Sophie, governments around the world are now placing greater scrutiny on forced labor and supply chain transparency. And companies are facing growing pressure to uphold human rights standards. In your view, what is the biggest, maybe blind spot for Taiwanese businesses when it comes to human rights due diligence?
Wow, that's a big question. Well, my experience with companies generally, not just Taiwanese ones, but generally, American ones, European ones, Australian ones, Japanese ones, is that they will always say that they too are concerned about human rights and that they would never tolerate forced labor in their supply chains. And yet the effort they put into actually scrutinizing those supply chains and their own productions often leave a great deal to be desired. And this was especially clear in the immediate awareness about the crisis across the Uyghur region, that many companies really had very little interest in or had put very little effort into understanding what they were sourcing from that particular region. But CHRD just finished a project about child labor in secondary vocational programs in the mainland. So these are obligatory for kids who are going to vocational schools to complete before they graduate. And as part of that research, we wrote to a number of companies that we knew were sourcing from Chinese companies that were engaging underage workers in these vocational programs. And the responses really left a lot to be desired. I wasn't surprised by them, but most of the companies just didn't respond. Those that did said either, we don't have that problem, but they couldn't substantiate
their claim.
Or they said, well, we'll go have a bit of a look and get back to you, and then didn't.
Then, of course.
And I think from their perspective, the calculation is between, getting found out to be using this kind of labor and having that reality amplified in a way that actually costs them money or costs them their reputation, or just continuing with business as normal and getting away with it. And
we've heard about child labor, forced labor for quite some time now. Would you say things are gradually getting better or worse?
It's really hard to answer that question because it's not as if we have the perfect data set, from time one versus now. I think what's very clear is that, the Chinese government's systems and laws can't necessarily be relied on, although we did find some evidence of administrative fines and penalties being applied for companies, companies, yes, found to be using underage workers.
Oh, wow.
But I think the single biggest problem is that companies are not, either inside or outside China, are not necessarily legally required to pursue human rights due diligence, which is really a practice whereby a company looks at its own operations, ideally once a year, to find out whether they're creating or contributing to human rights violations and remedying them. It's a basic due diligence process, and most companies just don't want to know. Because often if they find out that there are problems, it's going to cost them money. It's going to reduce their profits to fix those problems. And so, I think part of the solution really lies in governments legislating this and really enforcing it. In a way, that's sort of the logic that went into the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the US, that suddenly companies had to prove that they had not used forced labor. Mm-hmm. But it's also it's a proactive step that companies have to take. But I also think there's a role for consumers in asking, why is it that this jacket or this pair of pants is so cheap? And am I contributing to this problem by purchasing goods, that might have been made with unpaid forced or child labor?
Yeah, just maybe think twice before you buy that really cheap pair of jeans.
Yes, exactly.
Ultimately, this gets to the distinction between having a free and vibrant civil society and not having one. We're having these conversations in our countries because we have free media, we have human rights organizations, we have labor unions that are independent. China has none of these things. And so the problem there, it's not that people don't care about forced labor if they had the opportunity to learn about it and do something about it in China, but they simply don't.
It's amazing to think what the Chinese economy would look like now if labor rights had been respected from the 80s forward, if there had been multiple independent unions. And that was a key component of the 1989 protests, and indeed, some of the activism that I think the central government particularly sought to stamp out because it would have literally cost them their competitive edge.
Right. You're talking about America. Sorry, Glenn. Taiwan is home to debates about America's skepticism, which is the belief that the United States views Taiwan maybe merely as a strategic asset and could abandon it if circumstances change. From your vantage point in Washington, how do you view these concerns? And is the U.S.-Taiwan relationship primarily driven by interests, or is it hopefully increasingly rooted in, shared values?
So there are multiple ways to answer that. I think that debate is in part informed by the interference in the information space that the PRC is engaging in. They're trying to insert doubt into the Taiwanese discourse and to encourage Taiwanese people to doubt whether the United States would be there for them. Now, certainly the United States is having debates about its role in the world and creating a certain amount of uncertainty, not just within this part of the world, but also in Europe and elsewhere. And I think that's appropriate, actually, for the U.S. to think really clearly about what its capabilities and its commitments are and ensure that we bridge those gaps and we work with our partners elsewhere to maintain the freedoms and the opportunity for Taiwan to exert its autonomy. So, my answer to that question is we should listen to those doubts from the Taiwanese people when they're genuinely expressed, because Taiwan has been a long-standing partner of the United States. Well, the Republic of China, even before it was headquartered in Taiwan, before the capital was in Taipei, was also a close partner of the United States. This relationship goes back a very long way. And the U.S. and the Republic of China and then the Taiwanese government have been there for each other for a very long time. So I would just encourage people in Taiwan to remember that we have a shared history and that the PRC is trying to divide us and that we can work through whatever problems arise. I think it is a problem within a family of democratic nations in which the fundamentals are still so strong. There will be some people who care more about interests. There will be other people who care more about values. It's actually both, and that's appropriate as well. For me, Taiwan is an incredible success story because it's, I think, a shining pluralistic democracy, but also that a small, scrappy nation has built an incredible position in a key technology in the world, and that should be celebrated.
I want to ask you both to look into that crystal ball. Looking ahead, do you expect support for Taiwan among democratic countries to grow stronger, or do you see a risk that domestic political pressures and competing priorities could weaken that support? Sophie, or?
Well, I think I would answer that from a little bit of a different perspective, sure, because I'm not an expert on US-Taiwan relations. I think one of the most incredible developments with respect to documenting and advocating against the PRC's human rights violations over the last 10 or 20 years is the extraordinary solidarity, I think, that we see between independent civil society groups and activists here, people in the Uyghur community in Germany, Tibetan activists in the U.S. It's a very diverse community that years ago tended to focus on very specific issues, and now I think there's extraordinary transnational solidarity, and that is a remarkable asset, I think, to the larger effort. And Taiwanese NGOs play a part in that, and there are people who are real leaders in the community, including some of our hosts this week, who have really taken a leadership role in different kinds of work, whether it's Doublethink Labs, the China and the World Index, or its other projects, all the way through to people who are interested in providing training on how to combat disinformation or shape a legal case against transnational repression. It's such a vibrant community now across so many different countries, and I think that'll be an important part of how effective the movement is generally going forward.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I guess solidarity really goes a long way when it comes to support for Taiwan.
It does, and this is why I think we should think beyond just the government-to-government relations and the ability of Taiwan to sit in international forums, because Taiwanese civil society is active around the world and embraced around the world and building real deep ties in countries beyond just Europe, Japan, Australia, North America, but truly across Africa, across Latin America, spaces in which the PRC tries to deny Taiwan the ability to operate, but Taiwanese civil society is there, making people-to-people relationships, sharing experiences. And civil society groups in these nations are learning from them as well about how to combat the PRC interference that they're experiencing in their backyards, whether it has to do with interference in media spaces, whether it has to do with mines that open up, or natural resource exploitation that are despoiling the environment. all of this is really important, I think, and Taiwan really punches far above its weight with respect to its civil society. And in fact, it's really a force multiplier.
What are you worried about then for Taiwan in the near future? Is there something that worries you about Taiwan?
Not so much about Taiwan. What I worry about...
In the context of, I guess, its relation
with the PRC, right. What I worry about is, and I work every day on this, is ensuring that we all stand together. There is that saying that we hang together or we shall hang separately. Right. I don't know how to translate that into Chinese.
I'll try later. I'll try. Yeah.
But yeah, I'm sure you will. But the point is really the family of democratic nations, as Sophie I think alluded to, is we inherently understand each other. We know what it means to be free, what it means to be able to express our own thoughts at a level that makes it, I think, easy for us to work together in a way that authoritarians, they don't trust each other. North Korea, China, Russia, there is not that real level at society of working together. This is our strength, right? So what I worry about is and I work towards is to ensure that we mobilize and tap that strength so that we stand together, because I think together we will prevail.
That always, whenever I see the words together, that always reminds me of that scene in Planet of the Apes, or like apes together. Was that anyway? I just love that scene. I love that movie. Yeah. Some people argue that Taiwan can preserve peace simply by avoiding confrontation with Beijing and accommodating China's demands whenever possible, based on because we were talking about deterrence, based on your understanding of the Chinese Communist Party and its strategic thinking. Is that a realistic approach, and can accommodation actually provide security, or might it encourage even greater pressure from Beijing?
That's an excellent question. I mean, there's the phrase the status quo, the political status quo or the geostrategic status quo, and it suggests a certain stability or stasis. But I think we've seen over the last 15 years the status quo is actually a moving line. It was maybe a decade ago in which the PRC hardly ever, if at all, crossed the median line, right? Now this is an almost daily occurrence.
It is a daily occurrence.
And we accept it as the status quo, but it was not a decade ago.
It's the new normal now.
It is the new normal, exactly. So what we must, I think, be attentive to is not to cede the initiative to the PRC, not to allow them to define the terms of our existence. And so we spoke about togetherness. It is up to us collectively to say there are certain lines in PRC parlance, red lines, that you should not cross, and to ensure that they clearly understand that as they try to communicate to us. I think that is critical. So hoping that the PRC will not tighten the noose to suffocate Taiwan, I think, is the wrong approach. I think the right approach is to say that we stand together to ensure that the PRC stays on that side of the fence.
Thank you for saying that. Anyway, thank you for saying that. Yeah. When we talked about that red line, that the PRC's 红线, red line. Yeah. Here's a question that I want to put to Sophie is, since the implementation of Hong Kong's national security law, I guess few cases have attracted more attention than that of Jimmy Lai. Yeah. And you followed the case very closely for years. Why do you think, it's a rhetorical question, why do you think Beijing has been so determined to pursue him? And beyond Jimmy Lai himself, what message is the Chinese government trying to send through this case?
Well, actually, if I can tie these two things together, right. The human rights answer to the question that you just posed to Glenn, is essentially that, for decades, the Chinese government has not really had to deal with any unpleasant consequences for its unrepentant human rights violations at home.
Exactly, with impunity, basically.
And that, I think, in turn has enabled or emboldened it to commit human rights violations in other countries. I think if there had been much stronger responses with real policy consequences to Tiananmen, for example, or to the mass arbitrary detention of Uyghurs, tick on down the list, we might be in a very different situation now. And I think it really is incumbent on democracies to accept that the direction of these trends over the years is one that they should be worried about and should prompt them to respond in much tougher ways. I think Beijing's pursuit of Jimmy Lai is not just about him
right.
and his activities, which were all, of course, perfectly legal, but I think it's also a test for other governments to see just how far Beijing can go to lock up somebody who's known globally, who published newspapers, is a vocal pro-democracy figure, to see whether other governments will really push back in response. And so far, I think the relatively anemic response of democracies to Jimmy Lai's detention is very worrying, especially because he's not in good health. He's not young. Nobody goes to a Chinese prison to get healthy. And it's such a powerful statement about how Beijing has changed Hong Kong over the last decade. If the idea that we would have been sitting here 10 years ago talking about the numbers of political prisoners in Hong Kong, really would have been, quite a stretch of the imagination.
That's right.
The fact that, layer upon layer of new national security legislation keeps getting imposed by Beijing in Hong Kong, in an environment that's now so heavily securitized, it's difficult to imagine anybody, mounting any sort of a threat. But that's not Beijing's point. It's that it's going to reserve unto itself the power to lock up anybody it doesn't like for saying things it doesn't like whenever it feels like it.
Now that we're talking about Beijing's goal or aim, many people assume that Xi Jinping's ultimate goal is the unification of Taiwan. Which, let me rephrase that. It's not unification. I think it's invasion. That's one of the point when I do the news, our reporter would write, Beijing's intention to unify Taiwan, I would cross it out and I would say invade Taiwan, because we were never, I guess, united. To me, it's invasion. Others argue that, Taiwan is the only piece of a much, much larger ambition. From your perspective, what is Xi Jinping ultimately trying to achieve? Absorbing Taiwan, conquering Taiwan, that's all?
Well, so it's layered. For one thing, Taiwan, from his perspective, is a piece of unfinished business from the Chinese Civil War. And more importantly, it's something that no other Chinese leader, not even Mao, could solve. If he were able to absorb, not unify, but absorb Taiwan, it would put him above all other CCP leaders.
It would cement his legacy.
Indeed, that's right. And we've already seen he's elevated his own thought to the Constitution, to the level of thought, which only Mao has. This would put him ahead of Mao. So there is that. This is something that every Chinese leader has dreamed of, and if he were to realize it, wow for him. Okay, so there's that. But the second part is it changes the whole geostrategic environment of the Western Pacific. And for that, it means... right. And so it changes the context for Japan, for Korea, for the United States, obviously for Taiwan most acutely. And so it rewires the entire map of this part of the globe and the political influence that China would have. And it kicks the US out of its position as a guarantor of international peace and security in this region, which would change the relationship that Japan and Korea have towards China as well. So there is that as well. It is his sort of gambit for asserting dominance, hegemony in this part of the world.
China's hegemony. China is facing significant economic challenges, from slowing growth to high youth unemployment. Do you think these pressures make Beijing more cautious when it comes to Taiwan, or maybe the other way around, or could they actually increase the temptation to take risks abroad in order to strengthen domestic legitimacy? Make it more likely that Xi Jinping is going to wake up and be like, today's the day. These challenges, how do they influence Xi Jinping's thinking?
I think in his perfect world, there would not be an invasion, there would be a capitulation. He would make the costs of resistance so great that Taiwan would simply surrender, choose not to fight. The United States would look at the costs of defending Taiwan and say this is not a battle we want. That's within our power to prevent. So there are things we need to do today, tomorrow, over the next 10 years to ensure that does not happen. And that has to do with fighting in the information space to ensure that the PRC does not divide Taiwan internally, that Taiwanese people truly get to express their preferences, their genuine preferences, without interference from the PRC, whatever those may be, right? And so I think ultimately that's what he would prefer, not to have to fight, not for Chinese people to be seen to be killing other people of Chinese ethnicity. This would be extremely complicated. This would be politically very complicated, right. even for him at home. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's a situation he'd prefer to avoid.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Before we wrap this up, I want to. It's probably not easy when we're talking about China, but I want to leave people with something to feel positive about, to be hopeful for. Can you share with me what I guess you, any projects, any upcoming projects that you're working on, or things that we could look forward to in the near future for you, Sophie?
Sure. Well, I want to come back to something that you said much earlier about, we were talking about the hopes that we had decades ago about the direction
right.
that the Chinese government might go. And I would just want to point out that there are not a small number of people across the country who believe deeply in the merits of democracy and free speech and the rule of law, and who go out every single day
we're talking about
and
China?
take enormous risks in the mainland to try to make those things a reality. And maybe I will just say a word about the community of human rights lawyers, people who really take the idea of using the law seriously to try to defend people's rights. This week, we're marking the 11th anniversary of a nationwide crackdown in 2015 on human rights lawyers. About 300 people across the country were disbarred, they were disappeared, they were prosecuted. But amazingly, this community persists. They keep taking clients, they keep trying to take cases into court, they keep writing legal briefs. They persist believing that that is the way that the government should work, that society should process problems through a legal system, that people have a right to defense. They believe in fair trial rights, and even though they're taking enormous personal and professional risks, they persist. And I think that's extraordinary, and that we should remember and applaud that work.
It is extraordinary. I don't have. If I were one of them, I don't know if I would do the same. I might not have persevered. Thank you to them. And what about you, Glenn?
So their example inspires me in my work, but I think I live by the mantra, create the world you want to live in. And the work that I do every day is to ensure that the outcomes for me, my child's generation, are positive ones, that we avert what might be disasters or unfavorable outcomes, and we produce better ones. And so that keeps me in it. And that, we work with partners in Taiwan and Japan and even in the PRC, people of tremendous courage who are fighting that battle every day. Democracy, democratization is not an end state, it's a practice. We get up every morning and we simply do it. And we should not take for granted that it is stable. We have to continue to breathe strength and life into it every day. And I think a lot of more traditional consolidated democracies are experiencing that right now, that we need to dig deep and to redouble our effort to ensure that the things that matter to us are given a new life.
Thank you. That was a very good note that I want to end this show on. I'm going to do the next part in Chinese if you don't mind me.
Sure.
今天的宵夜间来讲，我们聊了很多关于像是中国的人权的问题。还有中国与台湾的关系，其实每一次在讲到这些，你知道台湾对于中国的讨论的时候，我有时候会充满了希望，有时候也会感到很无力哦。因为有时候我会觉得说，来自台湾海峡对面的那些，你说是警讯也好，威胁也好，我认为都已经这么明显了。但有时候我们却还是没有办法讨论出一个结果，然后可以让我们更有效率的，或者是更快的。解决掉一些问题，然后让台湾可以成为一个更好的社会、更好的国家。 但我相信这可能是一个必经的过程哦。这些讨论有时候即便让人不舒服，却仍然是必要的。今天非常感谢 Glenn 还有 Sophie，Thank you to you both for coming to our show。来到宵夜进来讲，那我们今天晚上先这样好了，我们下次见，拜拜。Thank you.
Nice. That was fun.
It's